Lynn, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the Atwater Library. Your dedication and support for literacy make you a true champion in Montreal. So I specifically chose this time of year to launch my book, a rare solar eclipse, which symbolizes renewal, and the spring equinox, which symbolizes new beginnings. This week, I also celebrated my mother's 95th birthday and my 42nd wedding anniversary, 27 of the happiest years of my life. Years ago, I was recovering from a life-saving stem cell transplant to combat a rare blood disorder. With time, I came to see that my survival was somehow predicated on probing the darkest recesses of humanity to lift certain subjects a little closer to the light. And so as I bring another difficult topic to the page, I've decided that for my next book, I will be writing about dryer lint or the riveting history of office supplies, and I'll try my best to make it a page turner. This time around, I've written about sexual predation of children, the lucrative aspects of buying and selling pornography on the dark net, and the devastation left in the wake of crimes against our youngest members of society. But more importantly, it's a story about the heartfelt friendship between two teenage boys who keep a secret, Arthur W. Barnes and Ernie Castlefrank. They're lovable bad guys, but you root for them anyway, because as the reader, your own empathy for children who have suffered an injustice will shape your perspective. You may not be able to fully forgive them, but hopefully you will understand the chaos of their adult lives. Monday Rent Boy is a literary mystery about friendship, vulnerability, family secrecy, shame, and divided loyalties. It's about mentorship and being a bystander. But above all, it's about resilience, a trait that is learned rather than inherited. Well, no one is born resilient, but maybe there is a nature-nurture component that gives people a leg up, the capacity to overcome strife or trauma. But I believe it comes from the presence of having at least one stable and committed relationship. Someone who can provide a scaffolding to buffer a child from developmental destruction. It's called human connection. Resilience increases a person's capacity to bounce back from adversity. I did wonder, is it even possible to bounce back from chronic child abuse when your innocence has been stolen and the hole that's left behind is filled with shame and a lack of trust for future relationships? And maybe in the hole, there's a 40-ouncer of vodka or a bottle of OxyContin and thoughts about whether the light fixture can hold your weight. Tough stuff. But resilience has a dark side. Though undeniably valuable, resilience can inadvertently normalize detestable behavior, especially when extreme situations become routine, thus blurring the gravity of the situation at hand. It's a coping mechanism that masquerades as resilience and allows a person to endure ongoing hardship. It's called resignation. An even worse outcome of unaddressed abuse is that empathy for others is compromised. In my novel, I look at the distinguishing factors that might help a person overcome trauma versus the situations that might crush another. I did dozens of interviews with victims of child exploitation. A 50-year-old man shared with me that he was a key member of a children's theater company in Minneapolis. In order to secure a lead role, he explained, it was expected that the boys would offer sexual favors to the founder and director of the company. A 30-year-old man spoke to me about being groomed and molested at a prestigious summer camp in New England. His father was chairman of the board, which stopped him from stepping forward. He was 11 when it all began. A 70-year-old man told me that he was raped by a priest, and a year after that, he had a 3-year relationship with a nun. He told me she was his only true love. He was 12, she was 46. In a breezy, matter-of-fact way, he also said he'd blown through 4 marriages and had slept with hundreds of women. I will let you make your own conclusions about what he was trying to navigate or shake off or compensate for. These 3 men were the boys who crawled into their adult lives with addictions, drugs, alcohol, and sex. My task as a writer was to find a way to tell their stories because they don't have the stomach to tell it themselves. But they did all find lasting comfort when the weight of their stories was loosened from their chests. It's crucial to recognize that many survivors, regardless of gender, still struggle to find it safe enough to speak out. The average man waits at least 20 years to come forward. Most stay in the shadows, which makes it impossible to quantify the true number of men and women adversely affected who didn't have the opportunity or courage to speak out. There were two common strands to all the stories I gathered. Everyone had been groomed. Grooming is the process of building trust and an emotional connection with a potential victim to manipulate and exploit them, often for the purpose of sexual abuse. And the second strand was that everyone had some form of addiction, not all of them unhealthy. One man has run 42 marathons. But the big question on everyone's lips when I first began to research this topic, why go there? Why venture into such dark territory when there are countless other paths that are less fraught with discomfort and even revulsion? The short answer is that after completing the first draft, I was taken aback to discover a common theme running through all of my books, a focus on children in adverse situations, A Secret Music, The Ghost Garden, and now Monday Rent Boy. What holds paramount interest for me is tracing the trajectory of the injured child as he or she navigates the journey towards adulthood, and what does that look like? The more urgent answer to the question of why write this book, I came to see that it needed to be written and hopefully read. Certain subjects are simply off the table. This is one of them. The very first iteration of this book was an exploration of temptation. What tempts us to do good deeds versus what leads us astray to commit acts of evil? Moreover, do our life experiences nudge us toward one direction or the other? Are we born with our values, or are they shaped by the cues and responses we receive from other people? The theme of temptation was a trampoline through a portal I could never have envisioned. I went to some very dark places. It was a comfort to tell myself that at any time I could walk away from this project. Did I have nightmares and sweaty dreams and big doubts? Yes, I did. But the more I plowed forward, the more resolute I became. That's when I met Simon. Simon has an aversion to drinking chocolate milk. The smell evokes an association with the pastor of his former church, underscoring the enduring impact of our negative past experiences. PTSD. Years and even decades have passed, and the scent of chocolate milk is still causing a pain somewhere in his body and mind. Maybe both. The body is the storage locker for our emotions. I began to weave fragments of interviews into fiction, always mindful of respecting the privacy of those who had bravely shared their stories of shame, confusion, and yes, even moments of complicity. Interestingly enough, as I was preparing my talk for tonight, I was also reading Tom Lake, a stunning novel my friend Colette Connor described as taking a warm bath or being wrapped in a cashmere blanket. Somehow, I don't write cashmere blanket stories. My goal was to write a novel about sex abuse, the grooming and manipulation of innocent children, and self-destruction, and leave the reader feeling optimistic. I know, easy, right? It meant that I had to take every opportunity to lighten the batter and make the story as readable as possible. My hope is that you will love my characters as much as I do. Arthur Barnes and Ernie Castlefranc fail forward, looking for their power in the broken places in order to regain trust, feel love, laugh, and thrive. I want you to remember that sexual abuse persists because it's hard to talk about. It therefore thrives in silence, leaving children nowhere to turn. Damaged children become damaged adults, and the cycle of unearned disadvantage continues. Which brings me around to the Catholic Church. At the outset, I reached out to a friend, Monsignor Frederick Dolan, the vicar for Opus Dei in Canada. He's tall, dark, and impossibly handsome, and I'm sure he's part of central casting. I went for coffee at his lovely Montreal residence and bravely asked for the names of abusive priests. He did not have any to offer, but said he knew someone who could help. Monsignor Dolan contacted Bishop Thomas Dowd and arranged for a meeting. Shortly thereafter, walking through a downpour that served as a backdrop to my sense of unease, I climbed the steps to the bishop's office. As I hung up my coat in an armoire, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the two meeting rooms before me. The first was opulent, mahogany, velvet, intricate stained glass windows, a setting where I could envision Pope Frank indulging in a glass or two of grappa. In contrast, the second was a small white box, furnished with nothing but two wooden benches, reminiscent of a room where Cinderella might have lived. As Bishop Dowd and I convened in the austere setting on those two hard benches, I couldn't shake the feeling that he harbored suspicions about my intentions as a journalist. Yet, despite my initial apprehension and his, over the course of several hours, we engaged in a deep and meaningful discussion about my research. And then Bishop Dowd uttered these words: "Susan, whatever turns up, tell the truth. Do not shield the Catholic Church. They don't deserve it. They had no plan." We were even able to share that the hypocritical stance against homosexual relationships, the abuse of clerical power, and the betrayal of trust has left many congregants questioning their faith or walking away from Catholicism altogether. With an affirmation from the bishop, I never looked back. Months after that fateful first meeting on those wooden benches, Bishop Dowd took the stand in the Father Brian Boucher case. Boucher had been accused of sexual assault over a 20-year period as he bounced between 10 Quebec churches. Bishop Dowd shared a 250-page report with the police, and soon after, Brian Boucher went to a federal penitentiary, and Bishop Dowd was sent to a new ministry somewhere near Sault Ste. Marie. Transfers, it seems, happen for good deeds as well as bad ones. But as I researched what might have happened to one of my characters, who was completely bereft of adult support except from his abusers, I followed the trail to another, more insidious consequence of the church's abuse scandal. The decades of cover-up, combined with the rise of the dark web, empowered abuse and networks of abusers far beyond the orbit of the church, creating a nightmarish proliferation of child abuse content on the internet and on the darknet browsers like Tor, Freenet, and I2P. Add in the ability of customers to make anonymous payments with cryptocurrency, and the worldwide welfare of children has never been so precarious. I was looking at two parallel worlds, the Catholic Church and the darknet, two places where children were unsafe, and the common denominator was secrecy. This is the puzzle I was piecing together as I wrote the first draft of Monday Rent Boy. If you tolerate something, it proliferates. While the Catholic Church did not condone sexual abuse or create a pathway to the darknet, of course not, its tolerance through willful blindness led to a devastating consequence. When faced with the chance to influence over 1.3 billion members, they prioritized protecting the institution. The grim outcome? A rampant state where children are targeted, manipulated, and exploited for personal gain on the internet, deep web, and dark web. It's a situation that any organization would find devastating to bear even 1 teaspoon of responsibility for. When I began the long years of research for Monday Rent Boy, I had plenty of sordid company. Hollywood's Harvey Weinstein. Johnny Kitagawa molested hundreds of boys as the titan of a music company that recruited singers for boy bands in Japan. Larry Nassar, the predator gymnastics coach. Jeffrey Epstein. The Boy Scouts filed for Chapter 11 as they processed sexual abuse claims to the tune of $2.46 billion. Benjamin Faulkner, a Canadian from Ontario, and Patrick Faulty from Tennessee, were running an empire on the darknet called the Gift Box Exchange. The gift was children, and the exchange was photography and videos of depravity that would defy your imagination. But there was one story I followed with a magnifying glass. Jimmy Savile, a beloved BBC entertainer who was knighted by Queen Elizabeth at the behest of Margaret Thatcher for his philanthropy in foster homes and children's hospitals. His legacy in Britain was so profound that upon his death, he was buried in a golden coffin. The accolades were effusive. The engraving on his headstone was self-chosen. It read, "It was good while it lasted." Posthumously, it was revealed that in the span of 50 years, he had abused over 1,000 children. An even bigger crime, people knew. Savile was probably laughing up his sleeve that his behavior was tolerated year after year and decade after decade. Everyone knew it was wrong. The children, the adults, the executives, Jimmy himself. Why didn't anybody stop him? Jimmy Savile was the inspiration for the most despicable character in Monday Rent Boy. This long list of transgressors comprises men in positions of power who used their influence for self-gratification. When you finish page 1, which opens with a confrontation between Arthur W. Barnes and Marina Phillips, the owner of a quaint little bookshop in Glastonbury, you might wonder how a girl from the Montreal suburbs ends up writing a book situated in the southwest of England. And is that a hotbed of abuse? No, not at all. Abuse is everywhere, from Nunavut to Berlin to Queensland. My choice of location was completely serendipitous. I had begun my work with an exploration of temptation, and so I studied the ideas of Dostoevsky and Oscar Wilde and C.S. Lewis. Much more mundane was that Google took me to the Garden of Eden and Eve's offer of an apple, the introduction of original sin, but also free will. My next online inquiry aimed to discern the significance of apples. Soon enough, I was facing a very long list of apple varieties: Cortland, Granny Smith, Macintosh, Orange Pippin, and there was one obscure variety called Arthur W. Barnes. Voila! Arthur W. Barnes would be my main character caught up in a tangled crisis of temptation. And where are these Arthur W. Barnes apples cultivated? In Somerset, England, in the tiny town of Glastonbury, which was called in ancient times the Isle of Avalon, the Isle of Apples. Incidentally, I never intended to stay in England. I always planned to bring my story home to Canada, but another more extraordinary coincidence was revealed that kept me in England. The focal point of Glastonbury is a UNESCO heritage site in the center of town known as the Tor. It's a prominent natural landmark that rises dramatically from the surrounding flat landscape. It's the image on the cover of the book. At its summit lie the ruins of a 13th century Catholic church. All that remains is the roofless St. Michael's Tower. My character, Ernie Castlefranc, claims that this tower marks the spot where the veil between our world and the next is thinnest. And here lies the synchronicity. The Tor in Glastonbury is not only a geographical reference, but also shares its name with the first darknet browser, also called Tor, an acronym for the Onion Router, a downloadable browser much like Chrome or Safari that was originally created by the US Navy to anonymously transmit classified intelligence worldwide. It quickly evolved into an unregulated domain catering to buyers and sellers seeking to conceal their transactions: drugs, guns, money laundering, child pornography. The Tor is a hub for illicit activities. Arthur W. Barnes, the Isle of Avalon, the Tor. My story could only unfold in Glastonbury, Somerset, in the United Kingdom. I did download the Tor browser so I could be part of the underworld for 24 hours, just enough time to understand how IP addresses are scrambled and bounced to servers around the world to create anonymity for buyers and sellers. I had so many worries that the FBI would come to my door with a battering ram of police officers, because believe me, I'm no detective. I do sleep with the hall light on. After writing the second draft, my incredible husband and I traveled to the UK with a purpose to do field research in Somerset. We went to every town mentioned in the book: Bristol, Bath, Crewkerne, the cinema in Bridgewater, the juvenile courthouse in Taunton, Glastonbury, mostly driving on impossibly narrow roads that are somehow referred to as the dual carriageway. With Hal behind the wheel, I mostly kept my eyes closed, hoping we were the sole inhabitants in all of England, as the hedges scraped the paint off our rental car right down to the frame. Despite those heart-stopping moments and speed limits reminiscent of the German Autobahn, the trip was unforgettable. Hal found the perfect apple orchard rimmed with sycamores, and we discovered a secluded playground complete with creaky swings and shadowy trees. We even saw a young teenager on the swings who had an uncanny resemblance to the Ernie I had envisioned. He happily let me take his photo, leapt off the swing at the high point, and offered to star in the movie version. Our journey was punctuated by so many moments of shiver-inducing synchronicity, so much so that by the 5th day, Hal woke up, turned to me and said, "I wonder what's going to happen to us today." On another note, I was deeply moved by the works of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Colson Whitehead, in particular, The Nickel Boys, not because his themes overlap with mine, rather it was his ability to handle a distressing subject matter without succumbing to sentimentality. He is, above all, a storyteller. My mission was to lead my characters, and you, the reader, down yet another shadowy path while still illuminating the way forward. The glue-like bond between Arthur and Ernie, forged in the fires of hardship and buried secrets, remained steadfast, defying distance and time to showcase the ultimate power of facing our past. What became evident was that although those wounds never fully vanish, they could be transformed into wellsprings of strength and perseverance, what I call the gift of trauma, a tomorrow brimming with potential and optimism, and of course, love. To close, I was determined to open my own eyes and write a novel that would help others open theirs. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Really great.
Thank you.
Testing. Hi. That is an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
And
very
it is
much.
a
Thank you. Thank you.
dazzling and repulsive book, as you said. The story is so tragic and so gripping that I have to start by saying, had a bit of difficulty getting into it. Some of us come to the reading of this book with our own history regarding sexual abuse and child abuse. So, it's just that caveat, but it is such a worthwhile read. It is so illuminating in so many ways that
thank you for saying that.
anybody who runs into that initial hurdle, I would really strongly encourage you to keep going. And I wanted to also say what a pleasure it is to be in this beautiful old building, so beautifully appointed by our ancestors. The Mechanics Institute tradition is such a wonderful, wonderful thing. A place for modest means, hopefully somebody like Ernie maybe to come and read, or Arthur, people who don't have books at home. I just wanted to say, you've said so many wonderful things and are so open and so generous. But I'm going to start by saying you said you needed to write this book and that it was part of a leitmotif of concern about injured children.
Yeah.
What was it about this particular story? What was the genesis of it? What got you going down this road?
I guess, growing up in the 1970s, I think that everybody, all of my friends, had some incident happen to them. And back in the 1970s, it was never addressed. It was never brought to the police. It was never, so what happened to me, I'm being very honest here, I was in an elevator at Fairview Mall. I was 11. I was very small for my age. And I was with my two best friends from grade 6. And we were trapped in the elevator with the emergency button pushed. And a man masturbated on my legs. And then the doors opened and the three of us ran straight ahead to what was the Kodak counter. And I had no idea what had happened, but the stricken look on our faces, the two people at the Kodak counter did not take our names, did not phone my mother. We were sent home after we described, to the best of our abilities, what had happened. So, number one, I came to realize that young children can really be manipulated and groomed. I had no idea what had happened to me, and so it was a real penny drop moment of the vulnerability of children who can be groomed and manipulated into situations that eventually become inextricable when you add the layer of secrecy. So it didn't become a trauma for me because I didn't know what it was. and it was a one-off situation. Does that answer?
You were able to run away.
Yes, I mean, I was able to run away, exactly.
Yeah, and I think probably many of us are having, you know, moments of recognition, like when things like that, terrible things happened to us. Um, you know, I think that's the beauty of the book, is that you're incredibly courageous, because as you said, this kind of thing thrives on secrecy, and it's so awful to contemplate, and yet it is so common. And now the dark web, as you said, has opened up this huge door. It's a hugely lucrative industry. Like, I did a little research myself before coming on today, and it's billions upon billions of dollars.
Oh, it is.
And almost all of the clientele is men. The children are girls and boys all over the world. Like right now, here in Montreal, there may be a pornographic shoot going on in some hotel. I can just imagine it. And the police have become schooled at studying the decor, the backdrop of these incidents, in order to try and figure out where it's going on and try and stop it.
Do you know, incidentally, CBC has a 4-part series called Pornhub, that's a podcast. Of course, I listen to everything, I read everything that I can. And one of the things that struck me about watching Pornhub, which is, you know, adult entertainment, was that employees at Pornhub, for the very first week of their, after they've been hired, they are tasked to sit in front of a computer and for 8 hours a day, watch pornography for 5 days straight. But what the interviewer did not go on to say is that this desensitizes a person. And so one of the things I talk about in Monday Rent Boy is that you can watch pornography, whether it's, you know, consenting adults or a child, and that eventually it becomes been there, seen that. And so that's how it escalates. That's how violence is introduced, because someone who is addicted to pornography, the same old no longer hits the spot. And so that really struck me listening to that CBC podcast. She did not make that point about how desensitized we get to seeing something over and over again and why it escalates.
Because the ability of humans to adapt is a great quality and a terrible fault.
Mm.
I wonder, so just to get back to these wonderful characters that you've created, these two lovely boys, they're very young when the story starts. They're 13. The abuse of one of them starts when he's 8.
Yes.
So when you talk about grooming, you are really talking about very young, very vulnerable. In the case of these two boys from very difficult family environments, Ernie especially, they are so vulnerable that this predatory priest, who is he the worst guy in the book?
No.
He's not. Okay.
No.
So I'll leave it to you when you read it to figure out who the worst guy is. I think I know who it might be if it's not the guy who's called the Zipper. He's a priest named, he has an Italian name.
Dr. Zipperto. Father Zipperto, which I call the Zipper.
The kids call him the Zipper, which
The
is
Zipper.
also a great image of kind of ugly accessibility or something. Anyway, so Arthur, they're injured children, there's no question, the two of them, and extremely vulnerable. It's a tremendous work of imagination to take us into their world. And the way you tell us the story, you alternate from being inside Arthur's head to being inside Ernie's head to being inside
Marina
Phillips, the bookseller, which goes to the theme of how books are a gate to freedom and to salvation, basically. The reader is the one who arguably does better ultimately.
Well,
it's
I
Arthur.
had to make it a very readable story, like a page turner. Hopefully, I don't want to be. I hope that you will find it a page turner. But in order to roll out such a difficult subject matter, I had to develop these characters so that you would care about them and care to find out what happens to them. So
it's a page turner. So I after getting over the initial kind of a sort of electrifying reaction I had to the theme as it became clear to me, I stayed up till 3:30 in the morning reading, and my daughter, who's not a very good sleeper, got up to go to the washroom, and she walked past my door and said, what are you doing? And I said, oh, no, don't interrupt. I'm busy right now. So
I love to hear that.
Yeah. No, it is unputdownable. There's no question about it.
Thank
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about these two guys. Okay, these two little boys who grow up, who go to school together, and who are each individually preyed upon by the Zipper without actually really even knowing it initially. They're special boys.
Right.
The psychology and the malice and the gaslighting, that goes on between this adult person who is, a venerable member of the community and these two very vulnerable kids, arguably at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale in the town. I'm wondering if you based that on a particular case or cases?
I did actually. I met a boy who was 7 years old at a sports day at a school, and this was 20 years ago. And when you talk about how some stories follow you around for a very long time, this was one of mine. So this was in the 1990s, and it was sports day, and the 7-year-old boy came in second at the finish line behind a much smaller boy who was 6. The 7-year-old boy leaped on the winner, took such a chunk out of his cheek that it required stitches. And he was sent to see a child psychiatrist. And what was revealed was that he was sexually abused, psychologically abused, emotionally abused. But I knew the parents. And, white picket fences, apple pie, this is what you think of when you meet the parents. They were lovely. And of course, deer in the headlights, and absolutely denied everything. And I remember thinking, oh, liar, liar, pants on fire. But what was later revealed was that it was not a family member, that it was somebody else. And so that little incident, when I talk about good and evil, I actually thought to myself, was this little boy born evil? Who could do something like that? So, bringing in the theme of temptation. So that little incident stayed with me for 20 years, 25 years. And to answer your question, I've had so many little stories that I've been gathering, and I actually started this book about 15 years ago. And then I wrote A Secret Music. I fell to the ground with a blood disorder, almost died, had a stem cell transplant. And while I was on the unit, I had this penny drop moment about the people that I was volunteering with at the Douglas Hospital, the locked doors, what was my life going to look like when I got out, being pumped up with medications. And then when a friend asked me if I would write her sister's story about schizophrenia, I felt it was the path that was traced for me. So I put, Arthur W. Barnes was my working title, I put Monday Rent Boy to the side. I worked on the Ghost Garden, and then the second I was done, I got back to Monday Rent Boy, because this is, I feel, a story that I've also been tasked with writing.
Well, I'm very glad that you did, because I don't think there are too many writers who can pull all of that together in the way that you did.
I do have claustrophobia from that elevator incident. I mean, I've had to have MRIs. You should see the routine that I have to have going in like that. But yes, that was a consequence of that elevator incident back in the department store. But a lot of people have asked me, how did you cope with the interviews and writing the story? And I must say it was very hard. I had lots of times where I went to bed at night and I thought, should I keep going? Should I continue with this? Is anybody going to read something like this? That was my biggest worry. Is a book like this going to land in the mud? People are going to close their eyes, like you drive by a car accident and you slow down, but you really don't want to see the mangled faces, and so you keep driving by. So that was why I felt I had to write a book that was so wrapped up in delicious characters that you would care about, and Marina Phillips, the bookshop owner, that she would really care about her story too, in order to then hit you over the head with my themes. Which
is a sign of great artistry, actually. And when I was reading it, I was thinking of the film Spotlight about the Boston Diocese.
I watched it 3 times in the last year.
And I'm sure many of you have seen it. And many of you have probably read Lyndon McIntyre's book, The Bishop's Man, which I think would make a perfect bookend to your book. And in fact, I wrote Lyndon McIntyre and told him that. And he said, oh, well, I'll better get it. But Lyndon is writing a book about the Easter Rising in Ireland. So he's got his head in a different set of problems. But I think he will get back to me. And I think maybe you should chat with him, because very few people have the courage to do that. And finally, I was just going to end on the story of inside the Freud archives. So Freud apparently was confronted by his women patients with stories of abuse by family members, by friends of the family, a little bit about, like, along the lines of what you're describing. And Freud was so aghast that he decided that these women were hysterical. And he put their stories to the side because it was so rampant amongst his patient group. And later, Jeffrey Mason wrote a book about how, in fact, these women's stories were undoubtedly true,
Right.
and that the patriarchy and the power structure couldn't deal with it, even though he was, arguably one of the most important figures in the science of psychology and psychiatry. So it is it's what you said, it is like a car wreck. Nobody can face it. The
Right.
abuse of power inside families of small children, inside kinship groups, the Boy Scouts, it is so mind-boggling that I do hope that your book goes out widely in the world.
Incidentally, I could have chosen a number of places where to hang my story. The Boy Scouts, for example, or any
the
number
private
of Hollywood
school.
private schools, Hollywood entertainment. And why I threw a shoe at the Catholic Church is because I'm personally affronted by their position on homosexuality. There are so many Catholic priests who are having active homosexual relationships, and yet at the highest echelons in Rome, they are denying people their right to sexual intimacy. And so,
while turning a blind eye.
While turning a blind eye to children's abuse. I mean,
But
what I was saying to Anne when we had a little pre-interview yesterday is that the priests who are having homosexual relationships have to keep that a secret. And therefore, they end up in the same pool as the priests who are having sexual relationships with children. A legitimate homosexual relationship, it's not legitimate in the Catholic Church, but it should be. They end up in the same cesspool, these two groups of people. And what do they share in common? The secrecy of it all. So that's why I chose the Catholic Church.
And it's made more poignant for you because your bone marrow transplant was facilitated and your donor was a young gay man from England.
It was my William Ashby Hall. My book is dedicated to him.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yes, so when I had my stem cell transplant, MSM, men who have sex with men, were not allowed to be blood donors or stem cell donors. And so I wrote letters to the international registry for 2 years running, just saying thank you for saving my life. My greatest gift would be to look you in the eye and thank you in person. And 27 months after I had my stem cell transplant, I got the call from William Ashby Hall. Let me tell you, my blood pressure fell to the ground. And we immediately made plans, my entire family, to go over to London, England, and meet him. But what was shocking to me is that William Ashby Hall is married to Michael Ashby Hall. So I immediately went back to the Royal Victoria Hospital, and I said, I have, family members who could have joined the HLA typing pool that were not allowed because of the rules in Canada. And she said to me, well, in Britain it's different, and secondly, he was your only shot. So, okay, fine, I accept that. It was my only chance at surviving, and so, but I have worked tirelessly for years getting that rule changed in Canada, and I can tell you right now, the rules have changed. So gay men are able to be stem cell donors, and we welcome gay men to be stem cell donors.
And blood donors.
And blood donors.
And I just found out that I am no longer considered a risk for mad cow disease, and I can give blood because I spent the early 80s in the UK and I was knocked off the list. And I think if I had mad cow, I'd probably be manifesting now, which is debatable. Anyway, so I wondered, one of the things that you talked about is resilience. And right. I think that is, we now become more familiar with PTSD and with trauma in general, and it's now commonly discussed. The issue of resilience comes up, and I think it's much bandied about term, and you I think do a brilliant thing, which is to link it to resignation, that sometimes resilience is not necessarily as positive as you would think. And I wondered if you could elaborate a bit about that.
I did try to roll this out in the book, the idea of resignation, and that is, when an 8-year-old child is groomed, it's usually because they are captivated by the person who is the groomer. And then as the layers of secrecy are, and the demands, and et cetera, that eventually that child who is now maybe 11 or 12 feels trapped and becomes almost resigned to the situation. And then I go on to say, just from the small sample pool of the people that I interviewed, a lack of empathy for other people is something that I was very disturbed to realize was also happening. But yes, resignation can masquerade as resilience. Mhm.
And you talked about that on page 41. As a boy of 8, when it all began, I hadn't realized that our situation was a type of imprisonment. We were taught that the word of a priest was as sacred as the Holy Communion wafer melting on our tongues. And it ends this paragraph, we were obedient. So the imprisonment, and at one point, one of the characters talks about how he's basically dead. Although he's alive, he's dead inside. So the idea of resilience doesn't really apply. And we're now talking about our friend Ernie.
Right, right.
This poor guy, Ernie, I just loved him to bits.
Oh,
I just loved that guy. I mean, I also loved Arthur because he was like me, hiding in books. But this guy, Ernie, it's a wonderful character, a wonderful, wonderful boy,
thank you so
man.
much.
And so trapped, so trapped. I kept trying to tell him, don't, Ernie, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't go there. And he can't help it. He is truly a prisoner.
Well, I tried to show that, the drip, drip, drip of poison and how that can be sewn into the seam of someone's soul when all of your relationships are unhealthy ones. Whereas Arthur, I don't want to give too much away, but Arthur had the mentorship that I spoke about. And so Arthur is able to achieve some of his dreams, whereas Ernie's decisions and the people that are surrounding Ernie just contributed to not having that one unconditional person who can help you rise above it all. But you didn't hear any of that, okay? Because I don't want to give away the story.
But Ernie is a fighter. He comes forward in a way that is so courageous. So he's not a hapless victim. He is a very bright, very talented guy who really does try. So it's really, really compelling, the narrative of Ernie.
My husband did post on Goodreads, which is kind of unfair, right? Because he's only going to give me 5 stars.
Wait a minute.
But he did say it's the best
That's nepotism.
ending.
Okay.
I know, we got to remove it. He said it's the best ending of any book he's ever read. Just saying.
So conflict of interest or what?
Yes,
anyway,
of course it is.
And
He's not here to defend himself.
We can't really walk away from this interview without at least mentioning Selwyn House, also known as Sell Your House if you live in Westmount, and Campbell Hendry, who some of us may have known socially. I met Campbell at a party years ago. I was very impressed by how brilliant and funny and quirky he was. And he was a friend of yours. You spoke at his funeral.
He was a good friend of mine.
And he was one of the students at Selwyn House.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these private schools, they're a hotbed of abuse as well. Not so much now, but in decades past. And my husband was the headmaster of Selwyn House, and before he got here, there was a class action lawsuit, and Campbell Hendry was leading the charge. And when Hal moved here, he said, "Oh my gosh, Susan, you have to meet Campbell. He's a real one-off. He's literary, he's funny," and we ended up becoming best friends. And he explained about the grooming of the boys, and that was a really terrible chapter in Selwyn's history, and at many other boys' schools in England and all across the world. And hopefully my book will address some of those issues as well. Hopefully when we open our eyes, we won't tolerate that anymore. Yeah.
And there's one of those Selwyn House teachers who's in a jail in Virginia, Richard Doucette. There are 3 teachers that were named in that class action suit. And that's just one of many, as you mentioned. The schools across Canada, we know about the cases in private schools perhaps more than we do in the public schools. It's an interesting situation. And also, I suspect we don't know as much as about what went on with young female victims, girls. We don't know as much about that. But I wonder what Campbell Hendry would say if he could read your book.
Oh, I think he'd be very proud of me. We talked about it a lot before he died recently, and we did talk about it a lot. He actually helped me get some really good interviews, and he would be very proud of me. And Campbell, if you're here, I'm dedicating this talk to you because Anne brought up your name. So Campbell, I love you so much.
He was a wonderful guy. Yeah. And I'm glad you told us about William Ashby Hall, because I think that's also a lovely sidebar story. Tell me a little bit about the significance of the Raven. I think we're running up against the clock now, but one of Ernie's great moments is that he recites the raven in school.
Yes. Well, the raven signifies, it's the bird who can live between this world and the next. And I can't really address that without tipping you off about the ending. But Ernie was an animal lover and a mathematician. Arthur was the bookish bookworm. And there's a scene in the book where Ernie is hit in the face by a belt. His stepfather hits him in the face with a belt loop, which is called England's first glory, which Arthur and Ernie call the first gory, because his father hits him with this belt buckle. And he's in class the next day, and the English teacher sees him all bashed up and insists on him reciting his homework. So he goes to the front of the class, and instead of reading his homework, he recites the raven from memory to the wonderment of the entire class. And when he says the last word, nevermore, he walks back to his seat, and the only sound in the room is the swish swash of his corduroy pants. And the raven is a spiritual bird representing the earthbound world and the other world. I'll just leave it there without giving too much away.
Beautiful. And I wondered, you said you had a reading that you might want to do.
Do we have time?
Do we have for 3 minutes?
5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Lynn is watching the clock for us. But
I will just read one little passage. Hi, Lucy. That Sunday afternoon, we were taking in the blue sky, or rather, I was standing around with my hands in my pockets while Ernie smoked a Lucky Strike in his backyard. And we noticed an injured orange and white kitten among the foxgloves by the train tracks. Its hind leg had been bitten by something. It was still bleeding, and the little thing could barely hobble. Ernie ran into the house for life-saving supplies and returned with his mother's best tea towel. Cats are the best mousetraps in the business, Ernie said, as he wrapped the damaged kitten in the soft white linen, securing it with adhesive tape from their medicine cabinet. We need to nurse this little guy back to health and keep him, Ernie added with complete optimism. Carefully, he carried it inside and up to his room, and the exhausted mewling kitten spent the next few hours on Ernie's bed. I was still there when Ernie's stepdad, shirtless in a sleeveless vest, appeared in the doorway and went ballistic that Ernie was harboring such a rabid, filthy thing. I'm not proud to say that I chose that moment to head for home. At school the next day, Ernie slid into his seat, his right eye swollen, almost closed, the white streaked with blood. The teacher walked down between the desks to take a look and said, "Castle Frank, off to the nurse." Head down, nostrils flaring, Ernie didn't budge from his seat. The class fell silent, and we all felt his shame. The teacher put his fists on his hips, raised his voice, and insisted, "Please go to the infirmary. It's possible you need a stitch or two, or at least an ice pack." Ernie glared up at him silently for a few long seconds, then grabbed his rucksack, stood and made for the door. "Arthur, go with him," the teacher ordered, and I scraped my chair back and followed Ernie into the corridor. His gait was off, as though his vision had also been affected. I wondered what the nurse would think. Her usual job was to comb our hair in search of nits or deal with a student who had a stomach ache. Ernie turned his head just before he entered the nurse's office and said, "My stepfather hit me with his belt buckle after the kitten stained my pillow. He got me in the nose and I bled like a stuck pig. I smeared the blood on his vest." His fist came next. That he was talking about it at all was a sign that the beating was much worse than usual. Ernie went in and closed the door behind him, leaving me leaning against the wall outside the tiny room. His stepfather's sterling belt buckle, passed down from his own father, was inscribed, "England's first glory." After he'd hit Ernie with the belt for the first time, we nicknamed it the First Gory. I hadn't escaped out the kitchen door fast enough during one such confrontation, and I'd heard his stepdad say, "I'm not hitting you, Ernie, I'm hitting the devil inside you." Ernie emerged from the nurse's office 15 minutes later in an overpowering waft of witch hazel, spearmint, and mercurochrome, which took me straight back to scraped knees when I was a little kid. My mother might have given me a slap on the backside every now and then and bawled me out on occasion, but no one had ever raised a violent hand to me. And so it was something of a mystery to see triumph written across Ernie's face, or maybe it was self-satisfaction or even glee. Later, he said by way of an explanation, tipping his head towards his bag, which now seemed overstuffed. When we returned to the classroom, the teacher, reacting to whatever that look was on Ernie's face, immediately called upon him to report on his English homework. My heart sank. What with the kitten and his stepfather's blows, surely he hadn't been able to complete the essay. Ernie gave me the tiniest wink from his good eye, walked to the front of the class, and recited from memory Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. He delivered the lengthy poem complete with quiet despair and darkest foreboding made grislier by the state of his bashed up face, and we hung on his every inflection. After he whispered, "Nevermore," all of us leaning forward to hear it, he returned to his seat, the only sound in the room, the swish-swash of his brown corduroy trousers. A tinge of respect in his tone, the teacher said, "Finely wrought, Castle Frank, finely wrought." Then he glanced down at his ledger and up at him. "For a passing grade, you'll still need to hand in your homework. I'll give you 2 more days." The bell rang and we were dismissed. Ernie sprang from his desk, grabbed his bag and bolted from the room, me on his heels. We left the school grounds at a dead run, stopping finally at the cemetery on Austin Road. Winded, we threw ourselves down on the grass and then rolled over onto our backs to stare at the billowy clouds moving across a charcoal sky. From his rucksack, he pulled out a stained-edged red wool blanket and once gave me that look of satisfaction. "Stole this from the sick bay." At first, I couldn't fathom that Ernie would steal from the concerned nurse, the only staff member who was universally loved, but all I could think of was that each little act of defiance was a way to hold his ground. "Don't look so fussed, I'll bring it back." And then he added, "My stepfather tried to dispose of the kitten before it was dead in the garden waste." "The kitten died?" I asked. Ernie nodded. "I snuck out and brought it back to my room while it was still breathing. I don't know when it died, but it released its bodily fluids on my bed. I buried it by the tracks before I came to school this morning." We focused our eyes on a dozen quaking aspens, trembling in the breeze, creating ripples of liquid gold. Ernie said, "Did you know if the leaves of an aspen can't move, they get eaten by insects? Predators?" We listened to the quiver of a million shimmery yellow leaves. Then Ernie said, "They're like brothers, the way the trees stand by each other." I pushed myself up on an elbow. "That kitten must have become separated from the litter, or his mother gave up on him for being the runt, not enough milk. We can make a marker for its grave." There were more than a dozen little sites marked by ice lolly sticks in the grassy banks close to the tracks. All the animals Ernie had fostered and buried. Ernie said, "The runt is always ridiculously happy to be alive. If they're loved, they catch up. But I couldn't save it. I was too late." He fell silent and closed his eyes, likely for the first time in more than 24 hours. Delicate blue veins were thin streaks on his milky lids. He was impossibly small and undernourished, ungroomed wheat blonde curls growing in again after the savage scalping he'd given himself weeks earlier. His childlike rib cage moving up and down. In that moment, he was as defenseless as the orange kitten, and I had to stop looking. I lay back down and faced the sky. There we were, far from what hurt us, being comforted by a brotherhood of trees. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm not crying. You're crying. I think we should nominate you, or somebody should, your publisher, for the Giller. Seriously. Your book is as moving and as important as Lyndon McIntyre's book was in 2009. I don't say that lightly. Anyway, so I think we need to close now. Thank you very much to Lynn Verge and the staff of the library for keeping this tradition going. It's a wonderful thing to be able to hear an author just in the part of the day to come and hear somebody present their work in this way. It's a great thing. Thank you to you,
Oh,
Susan,
thank you so much
for
the
writing
interview.
the book.
Thank you, Lynn, thank you for coming and listening.
And finally, thank you to all of you book lovers. I think you have before you a really important and wonderful read. So I would strongly urge you to purchase one and pass them off and tell people about it, because in this day of online everything, it's hard to sell a book to people who aren't really reading much anymore. And I think this one really is a worthwhile one to talk up. So thank you very much. And over to you, Lynn.